The note was propped against my coffee mug. That's the first thing I noticed when I came downstairs that Tuesday morning. My coffee mug, the old blue one my wife had given me the Christmas before she passed, and leaning right against it, a folded piece of paper with my son's handwriting on the outside. I almost didn't open it. I thought maybe it was a grocery list or a reminder about the car registration. Stupid, I know. You don't prop a grocery list against a man's coffee mug at 6 in the morning. But I suppose I wasn't ready for what was inside. I stood there in my kitchen, the kitchen I'd retiled myself back in 1987, the one with the slightly crooked backsplash that my wife used to joke about every single time she made tea, and I read what my son had written to me. Dad, I've spoken with Adrian and we've made a decision. We need you to find somewhere else to live. The house is in both our names now, as you know, and we've decided to list it. You have 30 days. I think you'll agree this is the cleanest solution for everyone. There's no need to make this difficult. No need to make this difficult. I set the note down. I poured my coffee. I sat at the kitchen table, and I looked out the window at the backyard, at the maple tree I'd planted the year my son was born. It was taller than the roofline now, branches spreading wide, and I thought about how I used to push him on a swing I'd hung from that tree. He must have been 4, maybe 5. He'd shout, "Higher, Dad," higher, and I'd push until my arms ached, and he'd laugh like the whole world was made just for him. His name is Colin. He's 41 years old. And he'd left that note against my coffee mug and driven to work without waking me up to say a single word to his face. I should tell you who I am, because this story doesn't make sense without it. My name is Stewart. I'm 67 years old. I spent 34 years working as a pipefitter for a mechanical contractor out of Hamilton, Ontario. Not a glamorous job, not the kind of thing that gets you invited to dinner parties as the interesting guest, but it was honest work, good union work, and I was good at it. I retired at 63 with a full pension, no debt, and a house in Burlington that I bought with my wife Sandra in 1983 for $112,000. Sandra died 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. From diagnosis to the end was 11 weeks. I don't talk about those 11 weeks very often, because there aren't words that do them justice, and the ones that come close are too heavy to carry in ordinary conversation. After she was gone, the house felt enormous. 3 bedrooms, a finished basement, a backyard that needed tending. My daughter-in-law Adrian mentioned, maybe 6 months after the funeral, that they were thinking about their options. Colin and Adrian had a condo in Oakville. Nice place, but small. They were talking about starting a family. Wouldn't it make sense, she said, for all of us to pool resources? I could add them to the deed. They'd take over the mortgage payments. There was no mortgage left. I owned the house outright. But I understood what she meant, and we'd share the space. I'd have company. They'd have room to grow. I thought about it for a long time. Colin came over for dinner one Sunday, and we talked about it for 3 hours. He was earnest. You know how your kids can be when they want something, but they're trying not to seem like they want it. He said all the right things. He said he wanted to look after me, that he didn't like thinking about me rattling around that big house alone, that it would be good for all of us. He said the word family 4 or 5 times. I said yes. I went to my lawyer, a woman named Patricia Ostrowski, who'd handled Sandra's estate, and I had the deed amended to add Colin's name, not Adrian's. I want to be clear about that. I added Colin. He was my son. I trusted him the way you trust someone you watched take their first steps. That was 2.5 years ago. They moved in that October. It was fine at first, genuinely fine. Colin was working in commercial real estate. He'd always had a good head for numbers, got that from Sandra, and Adrian was in marketing. They were busy. I kept mostly to myself, made dinner a few times a week, tended the garden, drove down to the Legion on Thursday evenings to play cribbage with my old friend Earl. Life had a shape to it again. Then Adrian's father came to visit for a week that December, and stayed for a month, and something shifted. His name is Douglas Reese. He's a retired financial advisor from Mississauga, the kind of man who corrects people's grammar and considers it a form of generosity. He and I had never warmed to each other. I think he found me unremarkable, a tradesman with a pension and no particular sophistication, and I found him the sort of person who mistakes confidence for intelligence. But I'd always been civil, for Colin's sake, for Adrian's sake. That Christmas Douglas sat at my kitchen table and told me, in what I think he genuinely believed was a helpful tone, that I was sitting on an asset that was underperforming. "This house is worth $1.3 million, maybe $1.4 million in this market," he said, swirling his coffee like it was cognac. "If you liquidated, put the equity into a diversified portfolio, you'd be generating far better returns than you're seeing on a paid-off house." I told him I wasn't interested in generating returns. I was interested in living in my house. He smiled the way people smile when they think you've said something childlike. "That's a perfectly valid perspective," he said. After he left, things were different. I couldn't point to one specific thing. It was more like a slow change in temperature. Adrian started spending more time in the common areas, redecorating things without asking. New throw pillows, a different arrangement in the living room. My wife's bookshelf moved to the basement to make room for a media console. Colin started having conversations with me that felt rehearsed, like he'd practiced them with someone before delivering them. Small things. The kind of things you tell yourself you're imagining. I wasn't imagining them. In February, Adrian mentioned that they'd spoken to a real estate agent, just to get a sense of the market, she said. Just a bit around information. I said that was their business, but the house wasn't going anywhere. She nodded and said, of course, absolutely, she'd just been curious. In March, I got a call from my bank. There had been an inquiry on my home, a title search, initiated through a real estate lawyer. I didn't recognize the firm's name. I called Patricia Ostrowski that afternoon. She called me back the next morning, and her voice was careful in the way that lawyers' voices get careful when they're trying not to alarm you while also telling you something alarming. "Stewart," she said, "there's been a document filed, a transfer of ownership application. It appears to have been submitted about 3 weeks ago." I sat down. "What kind of transfer?" "A full transfer. The application lists you as transferring your remaining interest in the property to Colin at zero consideration. It's a gift transfer." "Patricia," I said, "I didn't sign anything." There was a pause. "I know," she said. "I know you didn't, because I drew up the original deed transfer, and I know your signature, and what's on this application isn't quite right. We need to talk, and we need to move quickly." I want to tell you how I felt in that moment, sitting at my kitchen table with the phone in my hand. But I'm not sure I can explain it properly. It wasn't rage, not right away. It was more like the floor had gone soft beneath me, like the ground I'd believed was solid had turned out to be something else entirely. I thought about the note my son had left that morning about 30 days' notice, and I thought he knew. He'd known when he wrote that note. He thought this was already done. I called Earl that evening. Earl Kowalski. We'd worked together for 12 years as the mechanical contractor. He was in pipe fitting too, retired the same year I did. He came over and I showed him the note and told him what Patricia had said, and he sat across from me for a long time without saying anything. "Did Colin do this himself?" he finally said, "or did Reese put him up to it?" I told him I didn't know. I wasn't sure which answer would be worse. Patricia moved fast. She contacted the land registry office in Burlington and filed a fraud alert on the property, which effectively froze any sale or transfer while the matter was under investigation. She also contacted the Ontario Provincial Police's Financial Crimes Unit because what had happened, a fraudulent signature on a land transfer document, is not a civil matter. It's a crime. The investigator who took the case was a woman named Constable Maureen Toth. She came to the house, my house, on a Thursday afternoon and sat in my living room and asked me questions for 2 hours. She was thorough and she was kind, and she didn't make me feel foolish for having trusted my son. While all of this was happening, Colin didn't know I'd spoken to anyone. He came home that evening and made dinner. Pasta, I remember, something with a jarred sauce that Adrian had bought, and he talked to me about the Leafs and asked if I'd watched the game the night before. Normal, completely normal. I sat across from him and I answered his questions, and I thought about the fact that he had, somewhere, a document with my forged signature on it, and he was asking me about hockey. I didn't sleep well that week. I want to be honest about that. I'm not the kind of man who falls apart easily. You don't spend 34 years in the trades without developing a certain tolerance for difficulty. But that week was hard. I'd lie awake and think about Sandra, about whether she'd known something about Colin that I'd refused to see. She'd been protective of him in the way mothers are, but she'd also been clear-eyed. She used to say that Adrian was very focused on outcomes, I thought it was a compliment. On the following Tuesday, 12 days after I'd spoken to Patricia, Constable Tooth called me. They had enough to proceed. The signature had been forensically analyzed and confirmed as a forgery. The law firm that had filed the transfer application, a small outfit in Mississauga, one-man operation, had received instructions and documents by email from an account registered to Douglas Reese. Let me say that again clearly, because it took me a moment to absorb it too. It was Adrian's father who had organized this. He had found a compliant lawyer, forged my signature on a land transfer document, and filed an application to strip me of my home, my son. I still don't know how much Colin knew or when he knew it, and I'm not sure I'll ever have a complete answer to that. Had received a phone call from his father-in-law telling him that the house was being transferred and would be listed for sale, and had responded not by coming to tell me, not by refusing, but by leaving me a note about 30 days' notice. That is a sentence I've had to say to myself many times since then, very slowly, to make myself believe it's real. Douglas Reese was arrested on a Friday morning. The lawyer who filed the fraudulent application, a man named Conrad Price, who it turned out had a prior conduct review from the Law Society of Ontario, surrendered himself voluntarily and faced criminal charges as well as professional discipline. Both were charged with fraud over $5,000 and uttering forged documents. Colin was questioned by police. He was not charged. Constable Tooth explained to me that the evidence pointed to Reese and Price as the principals, and that proving Colin's criminal knowledge would be difficult. He cooperated with investigators, which is the generous way of saying he told them everything once it was clear the situation had collapsed. I was told by Patricia that he'd wept during his interview. I hope that's true. I really do. Not because I wanted him to suffer, but because weeping means something in you still knows the difference between right and wrong. The fraud alert on the property remained in place while the criminal proceedings moved forward. The house stayed mine, had always been mine really since the forged document had never been legally valid, and the real estate listing that Douglas Reese had apparently been coordinating with a separate agent was cancelled. Adrienne moved out 3 weeks after her father's arrest. She went to stay with a friend in Mississauga. Colin stayed for a while. He slept in the room they'd shared, ate meals mostly alone, left for work early and came home late. We had one conversation, a real one, about 6 weeks after everything came to light. He sat down across from me at the kitchen table, the same table where he'd left me that note, where his grandfather-in-law had once sat swirling his coffee and explaining my own house to me, and he told me he hadn't known about the forged signature. He said he'd known his father-in-law was working on something, that there had been talk about how to restructure the arrangement, but that he hadn't known it would involve fraud. I listened to all of it. I didn't interrupt. When he was finished, I told him I had one question. When he wrote that note about 30 days' notice, did he believe the transfer had already gone through? He looked at the table. Yes, he said. I thought it was done. And you were going to let me leave. He didn't answer that. He didn't have to. He moved out at the end of April. He and Adrian are separated now. Patricia tells me their divorce proceedings have begun. I don't know whether that's Colin's choice or hers. I'm not sure it matters to me. I had the locks changed in May, not because I was afraid the danger was gone, but because I needed the act of it. The locksmith was a young woman, maybe 25, and she worked quickly and efficiently. And when she was done, she handed me 2 new keys on a small ring, and I stood in my front hallway, and I felt, for the first time in months, that the house was mine again, in the way it had always been. The maple tree in the backyard bloomed late this year. It does that sometimes. Something about the drainage. The ground stays cold longer in that corner of the yard. But when it came in full, branches wide and green, reaching out over the fence line the way it's done for 40 years. I sat on the back step one evening in June, and I looked at it for a long time. Earl came for dinner that Thursday. We played cribbage at the kitchen table and drank coffee, and he told me about his grandkids. And I told him I'd been thinking about repainting the back bedroom. He said what colour, and I said I hadn't decided yet, and he said, well, you've got time. And I said, yes, I do. The criminal case against Douglas Reese goes to trial in the fall. Conrad Price has already entered a guilty plea and is awaiting sentencing. The Law Society has moved to disbar him. My lawyer tells me the evidence against Reese is solid, and the Crown is confident. I will be there. I intend to be there for every day of it. People have asked me since all of this came out whether I regret adding Colin to the deed. Whether I regret trusting him. I've thought about that question more than I'd like to admit. The answer is that I don't regret trusting him. I regret that he wasn't worth the trust I gave him. Those are different things, and the difference matters. I was the kind of father who trusted his son. He was the kind of father who trusted his son. He was the kind of son who let me. Sandra would have known, I think. She always read people more clearly than I did. She would have seen something in Douglas Reese that first Christmas, something in Adrian's manner, something in the way Colin changed when they were together. She would have taken me aside and said, "Stu, be careful," in that quiet voice she used when she didn't want to alarm me but needed me to hear her. I miss her every day. I think I always will. But I've also found that grief, over time, becomes less like drowning and more like weather. Present, sometimes heavy, but something you can stand in and keep walking. The house is still mine. The maple tree is 40 years old. I have my pension, my health, my friend Earl, my cribbage game on Thursdays, and 2 new keys on a small ring. That is enough. That is more than enough. That is everything. I keep coming back to that blue coffee mug. Sandra gave it to me the Christmas before she got sick. One of those small gifts that doesn't mean anything, until suddenly it means everything, and that's where Colin chose to leave his note. Not on the counter, not slipped under my door, against that mug. I don't know if he thought about that detail, or if it was just where he set it down without thinking. Either way, it's the detail I remember most. What happened in this house over those 2.5 years is something I've had to sit with very carefully. There's a version of the story where I'm simply a victim, an old man outmaneuvered by greed. And there's some truth in that. Douglas Reese was calculating and cynical, and he found a crack in my trust and drove straight through it. But if I'm being honest with myself, the crack was already there. I wanted so badly to believe that adding Colin to the deed was the right thing, the generous thing, the thing Sandra would have approved of, that I didn't ask the harder questions. I didn't ask why Adrian's father was suddenly so interested in the market value of my home. I didn't ask what restructuring the arrangement meant when Colin let that phrase slip one evening and I let it go. I wanted to believe the best of my son, and that desire made me careless. That's not self-pity, it's just the truth, and I think the truth is worth saying plainly. What saved me wasn't luck. It was the fact that 34 years in the trades had taught me that every piece of paper has consequences, and that I'd had the sense, years earlier, to hire a lawyer I trusted and to keep that relationship current. When the bank called about that title search, I didn't hesitate. I called Patricia that same afternoon. That one phone call, made calmly, without panic, from a lifetime habit of taking paperwork seriously, is what stopped the whole thing from going through. If I'd waited a week, if I talked myself out of it, if I decided I was probably overreacting, the house would have been listed before I understood what was happening. There's something in that worth holding on to. The choices that protect you are almost never dramatic. They're the boring ones. The lawyer you keep on file, the documents you read before signing, the habit of trusting your own unease when something feels slightly wrong. Douglas Reese was counting on me being too trusting, too tired, too grateful for company to look closely. He wasn't wrong about the trusting part. He was wrong to think that trust had no flaw. Colin is gone now. I don't know what we are to each other anymore. That's a question I haven't finished answering, and I suspect it'll take years. But I know what I am. I'm a man who built something real over a lifetime of honest work, who lost his wife, who got lonely, who made a mistake, and who didn't fall apart when the mistake became a crisis. That's the part I want to remember, not the betrayal. The steadiness. The maple tree is still out there, 40 years old this autumn. It doesn't know anything about forged signatures or fraud charges or 30 days notice. It just keeps growing. I find that genuinely comforting, in a way I can't quite explain, but don't feel the need to.